Welcome, councillors, to a special briefing on the strategic response that we're going to have to the government proposals, which is the RMA, and in moving into the other proposals that we're working through at the moment. This is really to give us a bit of a timeline and implications of the recent government proposals affecting regional government. It'll be a reasonably high-level summary of the legislation introduced this week, and then we'll be able to have a discussion about where we want to go and how we want to lead and influence in the next few months over the summer break. So I will hand it straight over to the staff who will be leading this. I just want to acknowledge that Will Harvey is also in the room. Good to see you, Will. Thanks for taking an interest in this space. It's good. So we've got Patrick and Cecilia. Did I say it right? I did. Who will be leading this? Over to you.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. Kia ora, councillors. So this is a briefing in the theme of our recent rapid response team briefings, where we're bringing you advice very quickly on government proposals. There's been some assumptions that we've had to make throughout the briefing that we've put together, and we've kept it at high strategic level to focus on what our advice is that you need to know now. I'll reflect that we don't have all of the detail to answer every specific detailed question you might have, but we will take down any of those detailed questions and come back to you with them. But I will also reflect we have, you might note, a small army of advisors that have fed into this advice that's coming to you. So we do have perspectives around consenting, around emergency management, around mana whenua partnership, all sorts of different perspectives that we can provide and come to the table to have that discussion with you as much as we can. So what we were conscious of when we initially spoke to you about this briefing last week, we'd said that we're going to focus on the resource management proposals and focus on the detail of the resource management proposals. We've pivoted slightly to focus on, instead of the what of the resource management proposals, to look at the so what of all of these government proposals together, and then the what next. There'll be all of that technical detail, and you'll note that we're missing Olivia as well. She's unfortunately sick today, but she is our RMA and RM reform guru, so she'll be on deck in future to be able to answer some of those questions. And we'll provide you more of that detailed analysis following this session as well, just so we can keep this session at that higher strategic level about what matters most at this point, or what our advice is around what matters most. Happy to pause for questions throughout this presentation. There will be a lot of questions that you do have, so keen to help you understand those. And turning first to this timeline. A number of you, or those of you in the room, have an A3 handout of this timeline blown up. What we're trying to illustrate here is the cumulative impact of a number of the government's proposals that have come to you in the last few weeks. There is a lot here, and we're trying to bring it together into a way that's containable in your minds. We've looked at, and our minds as well, to be fair. So we've looked at and broken the proposals down into a number of different sections. You'll see along the left in the blue, there's proposals around the function of regional government, in the green around the form of regional government, and then in that light blue around the funding of regional government. Those things all have implications with each other. And you'll note as well that government is seeking feedback on pieces of legislation or decisions that impact each of those three things, essentially concurrently. So you've said in previous conversations that form follows function. You're having to think about all of those things at the same time, which is quite difficult, and that's what we're here to help you work through, how you can best position yourselves and the council in that context. There's a couple of things that I wanted to mention across this timeline, and you may have other questions that this raises to you and brings out. One of them is that government is proposing in those two dark blue boxes along the top, the planning bill and the natural environment bill, the two sort of key pillars of the government's new resource management system that was introduced to the House 2 days ago. Government's proposing a short, sharp transition for those, around a 3-year transition. 3 years sounds like a long time, but for a system change of that scale, 3 years is incredibly fast. When you think about the previous government proposing a 10-year transition for their form of resource management replacement, you think about Three Waters, local water done well, you think about Te Pukenga, you think about Te Whatu Order. Those are large system changes, as will this one be, that include not only digital transformation and process transformation, but also human beings moving from place to place and thinking in different ways. So 3 years is quite a lot to contain all of that. On the point of transition, you'll note as well that there's a number of parallel transitions happening here. So there's Resource Management Act transitions that we're working through. At the same time as that emergency management bill is transitioning and we need to move systems, at the same time as the proposed simplifying local government CTB is transitioning, at the same time as the rates caps is transitioning. So there's a lot of things moving, needing to implement and think about in parallel, and each of those have implications for each other. It's not a one large change against a fixed ground. It's lots of moving parts all at the same time.
I've got a couple of questions. Do you want to finish off and then we'll take the questions?
Your questions will probably cover some of the points that I've got, so I'd rather hear it from you.
I've got Councillor Moody and then Councillor Scott.
Thanks, Patrick. Love the graphic. You mentioned other transformations just then of other big organised departments. How long do they, would be a more standard time? So I've got something to compare to the 3 years to. Is it 10 years normally, or?
It depends. Unfortunately, is the answer I have for you. So three would be very fast for a transition of this scale, is what I would say. Stephanie, do you have any other points on that?
I'll just compare it to the RM system. When it was created, the RMA, it took over a decade to transition. And indeed, I think the costs that were mentioned recently were at $1 billion, but I don't have that triangulated, and I don't know that that's $1989, but it's certainly high costs. And the work around time change and cost is something that the team will bring back to you, Councillor.
Thanks. So the RMA might have cost $1 billion to bring in back in 91, and 10 years would be a more usual time.
Councillor Scott?
Thank you. Patrick, I totally agree with you about the transition times of these things. And I'm just looking at the spatial plan, land use plan chapters, natural environment chapters, very, very short period for notification and decisions required. And I think that from our experience in that looks like, and so there's obviously a lot of lead time that was a lot of time early next year that's going to have to be put into actually how those things occur. It's easy enough to say, the mayors are going to do it, but, that's my concern.
Do you want to carry on? John, and then we'll carry on.
Just a question in regards, following on to Peter's question, the bottom lines, national standards, are going to be a key part of the process. Is there any indication, because there doesn't seem to be enough time for the regional council restructure conversation to include any of those bottom line conversations?
So the indication we've received excuse me, the indication we've received from central government and through the conversations you've had with the Department of Internal Affairs is government intends their proposed CTBs to be the decision makers across the majority of these resource management, these new resource management system functions. And so that's the process that they will be looking at. They're setting up their proposed CTBs with making the decisions in the new resource management legislation. I think one more...
carry on. Yeah.
One more point I would note in terms of how how the interactions between some of these proposals work, along with the proposed CTBs being decision-making bodies, is that the proposed rates capping system would be landing at the same time as the transition for a lot of these systems. So to your point, Councillor Moody, about the cost of transition, and to your point, Councillor Scott, about the cost of transition, that would be in the proposed rates capping environment of a 2 to 4% rates rise. At this stage, we've received no indication from central government of an intention to provide funding towards transition. Of course, there's submissions that still need to be worked through. There's the influencing that you can do as councillors that still need to be worked through in that space. But the funding and cost of transition is something that my team are looking to provide you advice on so you can understand that. And we're working very rapidly with Te Uru Kahika as well to understand what the scale of that cost could look like. But large, I think, to Stephanie's point, a significant cost, I would say.
And Patrick, just one question I have just before you move on to the next slide. That functions review is probably one of the most critical pieces in this part of the puzzle for right now. Have you heard any more? Has anybody heard any more about what the government's intention is on that functions review? Are they going to do that in isolation? Are they going to bring externals into that? Are they going to talk to the sector? Have you heard anything?
So what we've heard from the Department of Internal Affairs is that that's an internal government process that's being informed by all of the different agencies that have legislation that affects regional government. So Department of Conservation, Internal Affairs, NEMA, all of those agencies feeding into that.
But will they talk to regional government? Do you know?
We haven't been given an indication that there's a consultation process in there, but we were invited by the Department of Internal Affairs last week to provide input. We know that they're working on the Castalia report, and they invited this council to provide the Wild Window report and any other information we have. So our intention is to provide with your support, chairs, to provide that Wild Window report and the proactive work that this council did on the form and function of regional government to feed into that work to ensure that it's has input from regional councils. But that would be over to you and your councillors to push into that space as much as possible, because I don't believe we'll be asked.
No, that's my concern. Thank you.
And one final point on this slide as well is that across all of these changes, there are a number of different ministries and ministers represented. There's not one ministry that is responsible for all of these things, wrapping how to manage that alignment. So that's what the next 3 years look like based on government's proposals. This is what the next 3 months look like in order to help us move through the government's proposals that they've put on the table. I've put the over Christmas shutdown period as an incredibly light grey, because it won't really be a shaded out grey. There will still be work that needs to happen during that period from staff to support you to be able to engage in this process. Two things that I'll note there. The consultation on the natural environment and planning bills and the consultation on the emergency management bill, both of which have been introduced to the House this week. We don't know yet how long the select committee consultation process on those will be. We've assumed 6 weeks because that's broadly standard, and select committees aren't bound to follow 6 working weeks. They just follow 6 weeks. So we'll provide you further advice next week, likely when we know what the select committee consultation period is on both of those bills, and we'll be able to finalise this timeline for you. And during one of your previous sessions, councillors, one of the things that you noted is that you have an interest in, during the recess, engaging with stakeholders, partners and each other to be able to inform all of this work and to be able to thrash it out over the break. Staff are very happy to be led by you in terms of how you want to engage in this work, noting it has to happen quickly to meet the submission timeframes that the government have put to us across all of these proposals, and we've got some further thinking and advice at the end of this presentation on how we might approach those submissions to make them manageable for kaimahi and to make them effective and incisive for what government is looking for at this point across these proposals. But I'll pause there for questions if anyone has any questions on what the next 3 months look like.
I just guess it's a generic question for anyone who might be listening or public in the room. The submissions are open to everybody, aren't they? Not just councils, like on, not everything, but most of the elements within what's here is open for consultation.
So the Simplifying Local Government proposal is open for consultation to anyone, as will the Select Committee processes for the Natural Environment Bill and Emergency Management Bill. Rates capping is going through a targeted consultation process where Local Government New Zealand and Te Uru Kahika, amongst a number of other stakeholders, have been invited to provide feedback. So that one won't be open to broad feedback, but the others, Simplifying Local Government and the two bills, will be open to public feedback.
Due to sort of how contentious this is, what is the probability of one of us contributing to this from the outside as well as inside, as a council or as a separate person as well? I know sometimes it's understandable, like through some of the LGA stuff. But I guess in this instance, it's not advisable to do both. Can I have some comment on whether or not that's advisable? Would there be a
I
conflict?
don't know. We'll come back on that.
Because it's so big that I imagine the more submissions that lead into developing a better version of it, the better. I don't know.
Anyway, we'll come back on that. We'll move on.
So having given you a rundown on the overall timeframes, we wanted to roll into the implications a little bit. And this is a bit to your point, Councillor Robinson, about the significance of some of the implications of these proposals. We will come back to those timeframes at the end when we get to next steps. But this is to help you unpack what some of the implications look like across the proposals, and then we'll dive into the resource management reform section. You've seen this slide before. There's a national context and international context that all of this change is happening within. The proposals that have been coming to you over the last few weeks don't occur in a vacuum. Of course, government's work and your work as a council affects this context too. It can change various bits within this context, but just reminding you that this context is there in the background. So we spoke to you last week when we were talking about simplifying local government and rates capping as those being two legs of a stool. And the third leg of the stool, resource management reform, would be coming this week. As we've been thinking across the course of this week, that's an overly simplified version of what's actually happening. A stool is very simple, and a stool is strong, a stool just sits there. That's not what we're faced with. And that's not the situation that we have coming to us. There's a CDM bill, Emergency Management Bill, that was announced this week. There's a Biosecurity Act that's under review. There's all sorts of things that are happening and changing from this government perspective that are coming at you. So we're proposing it's less like a stool and more like a confluence of rivers. Several rivers coming together and joining together into a larger river, rougher and more mixed than any of the other individual pieces. That's how it's working in my head, I think, in that kind of way. And so, yeah, a stool undersells the significance of the proposals that are coming to us. There's a multiplying impact across all of these proposals. I would also say with a confluence, you can see it coming from quite a long way away. It doesn't really move, unlike a braided river. But then when you hit it, the waka still gets pretty bumpy, and that's where we're at now. We knew this change was coming at us. We knew it was coming at around this time. The waka's still bumpy as we're going through it, but you will stabilise it, councillors, with our support, and we'll come through the other side.
This is an observation and maybe a slightly ironic one. Your confluence there, that doesn't happen to come from the Hawke's Bay, does it?
That's the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. But I knew someone was going to ask, and so I'm so glad I wrote it down, Councillor.
Let's not do any.
My former stomping grounds.
Very quickly, so this is a summary of the recent announcements that have happened in the last couple of weeks. This is going to get more complex. Simplifying local government was announced 2 weeks ago. Rates caps last week. This week, 4 bills affecting regional government announced. 1 passed under urgency, 2 introduced, 2 related to the resource management system introduced, and 1 related to the emergency management system introduced. The proposal is for consultation and the parliamentary process early next year, and then from mid next year, all of that legislation coming into force. So it's sort of recapping that timeline that we talked about before. And this is a representation of the cumulative impacts of those. We will go once we're moving through the rapid response phase and into the much more detailed analysis. We will go deeper on this to support your thinking about it. But this is a very high level summary of what some of those processes and pieces of legislation that have been brought forward mean for the roles of central government, regional government, local government, TAs, iwi, and communities. And functionally, it's about shifting more across a number of those bills, shifting more decision making towards the centre, largely to create more consistency and certainty, and shifting roles away from regional government in particular, changing some roles around local government, and across a number of those, there's changes to the roles of iwi and communities as well. I'm happy to take any questions on this, but I won't go through each of the individual points. But I think the thing I'll leave you with is there are a lot of, or that I'll leave this slide with, is that there are a lot of impacts across all of those proposals that each individually would be significant, but together they take a similar vibe and have cumulative impact in a direction of fundamentally changing the roles and relationships between both different levels of government and iwi and communities as well.
Councillor Sunkel.
Just a comment, I've read the new EM bill and then reread 2002, and I think the minister got mentioned once figuratively in the old bill. Almost every clause in the new EM bill talks about the minister, the ability to intervene and take action. So there is I think to your point, there's an absolute centralisation sitting in that bill and in the other ones as I sort of read them.
Yeah, my observation is very much similar from the amount that I've read on the new environment and planning bills. There's a lot of interventions that the minister has the ability to have in each of those. So that is something that we may need to consider. Is that what we want for the communities, and is that what communities are after? I think I've got Councillor Scott online.
Yeah, thank you, Dion. One of my questions is, in terms of the minister, it might be a minister-appointed person. Is there any indication, like there's a few ministerial appointments at the moment in councils helping with local water done well, is there any indication that may be some sort of form that we get put forward to us in this transition period?
The phrase within the simplifying local government proposals, the phrase commissioners has been used, and I think the phrase commissioners was also used in the context of local water done well. In terms of what the powers are and what the roles of those are, I couldn't speak to that, especially given how high level the simplifying local government proposals are at this stage. But you could take a similarity in the language that's being used between those to see some similarity of roles, but I couldn't speak authoritatively on what the government's intent there is, Councillor.
Any other questions before we move on to the next? Okay, we'll move on. Patrick?
That's just our timeline again to reinforce. So turning to the new legislation that was introduced this week. Again, reminding you that this is very high level. We had a bit of a conversation last week in our briefing about the extent to which my team were doing some work looking at what we expected the resource management bills to include. We're having to sense check all of that work that we did that we'd done previously, because what we understood the bills to look like and then what the bills have actually ended up looking like. I brought them in here just to show you, as you'll all know, the significance of the size of them. But there's a lot for us to go through to ensure that what we expected them to contain are the same as what they do actually contain. So our work is still happening in the background on that before we provide you with the detail. But what we wanted to talk through was the content of some of the bills that were brought through, because the one that was unexpected, particularly in terms of how quickly it took effect, was the Resource Management Duration of Consents Amendment Bill. And I'll invite Phil to the table to be able to speak to that. Phil's one of our principal consents planners, who you'll know well, to be able to talk through what some of the implications of that look like for our consenting. But I'll also note that last week the Planning Bill and the Natural Environment Bill were introduced to the House. Their purposes are outlined there, but I'll have a couple of comments later about what those purposes look like in practice. But turning to the Resource Management Duration of Consents Amendment Bill, which takes effect much more rapidly, Phil, I'll hand over to you to unpack what that means for us.
Kia ora, councillors. Chair, thank you, Patrick. As Patrick said, this was a somewhat unexpectedly quick piece of legislative change. So we've done some high-level analysis in the last day or so. In terms of its immediate effect, what it largely does is extend any consent that will expire by the 31st of December 2027 to that date, extend that expiry date. There are some exceptions for water-related consents, which can't exceed 35 years if it would go beyond that date, but in practice in Canterbury, that's going to be very few consents. We haven't actually got the numbers on that exact thing. In terms of that, though, there are about 1,200 consents that would expire by the 31st of December 2027. The figure up there shows how they are broken down over the next 3 years. We only have 55 less this year, 427 next year, and 720 in 2027. So that's how those 1,200 consents break down. In practice, and this is averaged across all consent types, we really only see 30% of expiring consents actually get replaced with new consents. So we do a lot of consenting, about 1,200 applications a year that are not for replacements. So if you said an average year is 1,600 applications that we process, about 1,200 of them are for new consents, changes of conditions, transfers, things like that. So that could be things like works in riverbeds, discharges associated with earthworks and new subdivisions, those kind of one-off activities. However, if you take out those 30% of those 1,200 consents that would be expiring, it's about 350 odd consents. There's a cost saving to applicants of about $2.5 million based on the average processing costs. That has a flip side for the consent section, which is that's $2.5 million of expected revenue that the consent section won't bring in because we won't get those applications coming through. That's pretty much all I was going to cover off on the slide, but happy to take questions.
I've got a couple of questions, but I've just got one. That $2.5 million figure there, how confident are we of that number? Because that is very different than the numbers that the government's putting out.
Yeah. That number's based on an average processing cost for and largely across land uses, discharges and water permits. They are all slightly variable within that but our finance team has done a great job of sort of just really quickly pulling together some numbers. But that's the average cost for us to process. It doesn't include the costs that an applicant would accrue through hiring consultants and that side of the ledger. We don't have any control over those costs, so that's just what our costs would be.
Okay, so that's good. Councillor Robinson, and then I'll go to Councillor Mackay online.
No, thanks for this. Just regarding the reinstatement and extension of the consents, where an application has been made, immediately I'm thinking, what about those consents that would have, had they been renewed or reapplied, would be subject to clawback provisions? Does it include those?
Yes, it does. We did some numbers on that. We've got about 100 applications currently in process that would be caught in this grouping as well. Where currently working through our way how we'll communicate with that. Obviously, those applicants will have a choice. The Act gives them the opportunity to withdraw their applications and rely on the extra 2 years, roughly, that they would get. Alternatively, they may choose to continue with those applications, noting that they'll probably get a longer duration than 2 years if we were to proceed with those applications. That's going to be up to the applicant which way they would like to go. I know today, in fact, one of our planners said that she's already had contact from one of her applicants who was in this situation, and they've said they want to push on and get their new consents. So we'll see how that plays out.
Councillor Mackay? Megan?
No, that was my question, so I took my hand down.
Thanks. Councillor Sunkel.
Thank you. You, in this diagram, talk about 2029 as being the figure, and yet the conversation within Parliament and the advice is 2031 if you have the extension of. So just some clarity for me, given, yes, there's the extension to 2027 under this bill, but then the extra 2 or 3 years that will come with the RM. So in fact, we're not talking about a 3-year delay or 2-year delay, we're talking about a 5 to 6 year delay in action. So just a clarity of that.
Certainly. So the 2029 or 2027 date is the one we have certainty about. That's the legislation that has just passed. And so these numbers relate to that. The indicative 2031 date is actually from the Planning Act and Natural Environment Act. Bills at the moment. The bills that are going through, which indicate a further extension once those plans under those acts when they come through, the bills at the moment, fall into place. That's an indicative date because, at least from my very brief reading of the bills, there will be when the system gets turned on in each region of New Zealand will vary. And so I suspect that there is some flexibility in what that date will be depending on when the system comes in.
The other date, in fact, being the one. So I guess I'm just trying to tease out a wee bit of what it might look like given the two different dates and an expectation that government will do what they say they will do.
Yeah, certainly. Councillor Sunkel, I guess with the limited information we've got, the point I guess to draw your attention to is, irrespective of how many replacements don't come in, while we are still working under the RMA, the typical workload, if you like, of the consent section would still sit at around 1,200 applications a year. Now that's plus minus, there will be consent. So 1,200 is probably...
Thank you for that. It's a good clarification.
Any other questions at this point? Councillor Davis.
My question is about where compliance and the cost of compliance might fit in with that. So that's the savings in the application process with our staff, but where and how does compliance staff fit in?
I probably can't talk to the costs of that. It's not my area. All I would sort of say there is these consents will be live consents, so they'll just go back to being regular consents subject to our standard compliance processes.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Look, I apologise if you've already said this, but I lost connection there for a while. But land use consents will no longer be required. Is that right?
No, not at the moment. At the moment, they still will be. The current RMA settings continue on until the new system is switched on. They just like any other
land use consents won't be. But renewing land use consents is no longer required, is it? Because isn't that one of the signals the government has given?
Yes, that's correct. So an existing. It will depend on the terms of that consent. So one of the other things that I would point out is, while we see the 30% of applications get replaced, A replacement has to be for the same thing under the Act, under the RMA at the current time. So if people are not wanting to do the same thing anymore, it's not it doesn't necessarily fall into those provisions, and so we may still see some land use consenting where the current consent limits what can be done, and that wants to be changed. That will probably fit into that sort of that 1,200 that we would normally see coming through. But if people have consents that allow them to just carry on doing what they're already doing and they don't want to change, then they won't have to come in for a replacement.
Councillor Scott?
Yeah, thanks for this. There's been some chat around farm environment plans and how they fit in the system, and whether they are sort of a mini global consent for the operations that we now may have 4 or 5 consents for. Have you got any view on that, or is that something that may happen?
Not at the moment. Freshwater farm plans are in the new bills, but how they will interact with the current planning system hasn't been clarified, as far as I'm aware.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just an extension to that, I made note in my magnificent speech yesterday. In over-allocated zones, we utilise consents to claw back or manage. And so there's the question in my mind, where does a freshwater farm plan sit versus a need to claw back a statutory versus voluntary? So I guess you don't have an answer, but that's a question in my mind. Where does Canterbury and some of those other areas sit where we have over allocation of resource, whether it's water or nutrients? Do you see a way through for a reduction without requiring a statutory consent or the like? I'm just interested in the idea.
I'm not sure I can answer that, Councillor Single. I think that's probably a direction that could be explored, but I suggest that that's probably a question for the council.
I was just asking within the context of the processes we have today, and
we'll move to
what's
the next.
achievable.
We'll move to the next slide. Yep.
Thank you, Phil. And I'll also note, reinforce something that Phil mentioned as well, which is around reaching out to consent applicants who are affected by this. That's something our team are doing very shortly. So in terms of taking a customer-focused approach, we are proactively reaching out to those who are affected by the provisions of this Act. So shifting from what is immediately or what is about to become an Act to the 2 components of the new resource management system. So that Act that has just no, it's only past 3rd reading. It's still a bill. It's not quite an Act yet. But what we were just talking about, the consent duration component, is a bridge to this new system that government has introduced into the House this week. You'll have seen this before, or you may have seen this before through the government's press releases and through Ministry for the Environment work. This is what the Ministry for the Environment has put forward as the intent of the new resource management system, is their words, around what they're trying to achieve. You'll note that it broadly aligns with the expert advisory group's advice to government on what the new resource management would seek to achieve. But this is a summary of that. And in terms of how the system changes in order to achieve that, the Ministry for the Environment and government have been using some funnel diagrams, what they're calling funnels. The top left, the greyed out version, is what they're proposing the current RMA looks like. A small number of decisions at national direction, and then a large number of decisions being made at the consent by consent basis. And what they're proposing is that the new system will have more decisions made at that central level in terms of national direction, and a fewer number of decisions being made at a consent by consent basis. There's 2 new acts, 2 new bills that have been put forward to achieve that. A planning bill and a natural environment bill. They have a number of components in there that I will not purport to walk you through while Olivia's not in the room, because she knows all of the gory details of those. But that's an illustration of how the system is intended to look and the components within that system. This is a breakdown of a number of the core components within the system, and this is some of the analysis that we've put forward to you to explain some of the so whats for you and for Canterbury Regional Council. There's quite a lot there, so a couple of ones that I wanted to pull out in particular as they of interest to you, councillors, is around the use of national instruments, or which is what the new system will call what is currently called national direction, but national instruments will be the new phrasing that they'll use for that sort of direction setting. Intending to be more centralised and simplified, set by central government or set from the centre rather than being implemented on a regional basis. The phrasing around regional councils is interesting. Yes. Throughout all of the pieces of the legislation and the guidance from the Ministry for the Environment. At some points, the phrasing regional councils is used, at some points regional entities. It appears to me that there's still some changes of how each of these pieces of legislation and proposals interact that are flowing their way through the system. And there's not a full integration of how the simplifying local government proposals and this resource management system knit together. That will still be flowing through. Which is a bit eyebrow wrinkly. It makes it a bit difficult to know where you're at. But that phrasing of sometimes regional councils, sometimes regional entities, you'll see that. Combined planning,
just on that. I mean, I pulled up the Natural Environment Act, and the regional councils part that's within the first section of the new Environment Act lays out the functions of regional councils, and so the government is definitely sending a lot of mixed messages around, okay, what are the functions and where they're going to go, yet in the new bills that they're proposing to put into the House next week and go through Select Committee, this regional councils still have quite a specific prescribed role. My question is whether they are intending for regional councils to stay in that, and that means that when they hope that everything, it seems like they're trying to target every council to become a unitary, because that would be the combined function. So, I mean, there is a bit of mixed messaging going there, or an underhanded view that they kind of know what the end function or form looks like without actually wanting to tinker with the functions, I suppose. So it is really interesting to read through the Environment Act specifically. But in the Planning Act is where they talk about the regional cooperation space more than the Environment Act. So the Environment Act still is very much riddled right throughout it, as regional councils will do. One of the other parts that are just before we move on to the next section here, which was reinforced a lot at Parliament, was that the two new bills will be based on the goals, and so the goals will be the high level objectives for the government. So if you read through those goals, they are pretty much what will be prescribed as what the Act wants. And one of the things that I do find very interesting is that within the goals, it does say there, achieve no net loss in Indigenous biodiversity. And I've got a big question mark over that and saying who's going to do that stock take, and what does that mean in net? Does that mean that in the trading system that they're going to try and create? So these are questions that we're wanting to tease out. Does that, we're getting into the weeds type of thing here, because there's so much mixed messaging within the acts and within what we've been proposed in the reorganisation. Just had to, because this is, there's some relevant stuff there. Councillor Faulkner?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I just want to go back to my original question about the bottom lines. And I look at the management system and it says stronger environmental limits, but the CTBs have the power to set their own limits. And I'm confused which is going to be the chicken and which is going to be the egg.
The process, to my understanding, is that central government sets the limits around human health and sets a process for setting environmental limits, and then the regional council, whether or not it's a CTB that happens to be the decision maker of that regional council at that point, would then use the methodology prescribed by central government to set those environmental limits.
Supplementary, but from what I understand at the moment, it seems that those bottom lines have the potential to be overridden if the community so desires in the current conversation.
My memory, and I can definitely come back to you with further advice on this. Actually, I'll come back to you with further advice on this rather than scraping through my memory of the bills.
Councillor Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Dion. I must say I do agree with your explanation of the things that concern you, and the thing. Although these things read okay from the perspective, I think we've got to keep asking where's the glue that holds us together, because a really, really fast process, there's some shaky bits are going to fall off, and if we're going to put this thing together properly, then the people that need to understand what they're doing, and I'm just really concerned, and I don't think we've got enough people around that.
Peter, you just cut off.
Oh, sorry. I'm concerned there's no glue here, Dion. I think that's a question we've got to keep asking, and maybe in our submission is like, how's this all going to get held together? Because the moot point is okay. I think it's fine. I mean, we talked about these types of bills with the last government, and so nothing is really stands out. But the bit that does stand out is that we're going to pull this apart and we're going to put this in place, but I don't know how you can hold that together. So that's my observation.
Councillor Megan Mackay.
Kia ora. Dion, just because you've raised here about the ongoing role of regional council and your observations of that in the Act, or the two acts, or sorry, the two bills, I thought I would just add in there what I've seen as being really interesting is more what is out, like what used to be in the RMA and what is now out shows a really interesting picture, or what has changed. And when we look at what has changed, one of the key things that stands out to me is and this is maybe something we might need a little bit more advice on, is the change of Indigenous biodiversity, whereas previously district plans put all the rule framework around Indigenous biodiversity, and it seems to be picked up and moved over into the Natural Environment Act under the regional council functions, and that kind of poses a risk to me around regulatory relief or compensation for SNAs,
and
that will cause yes, and so if that's crossing over into regional council functions, and who knows, mega ministry might take us all over, but it would be good to clarify that, put that in the Act as something that we're concerned about, in our submission. And the other part was around the Planning Act, and now we're moving down to, I think, 15 zones, and which is way better than all the zones that we have at the moment. But I wonder if we need to turn our mind to some bespoke carve-outs within our region that those 15 zones just might not be appropriate for. And one that's come up recently or today with somebody was the Hamner Springs Alpine area being, particularly sensitive. It might be helpful for us to think about what those sensitive areas are for us, where the 15 might not be appropriate. And the only other thing I thought I would add is there is some really good stuff in this Act. There is both acts that are going to make it much easier from the RMA that we have now, but that does not take away that there's actually also some really challenging things and some conflicts that we need to work our way through.
Yeah, very good points there, Councillor. He's going to say something.
I just wanted to note one other difference from the NBA, the Natural and Built Environment Act, which was repealed. Recall, councillors, that when we went through that process, we sought a change from the RMA definition of rivers to include a better definition with regard to braided rivers. In these bills, that has not been put in. Instead, they have retained the definition of a river according to the RMA.
Did I have another question here from somebody? It was Councillor Robinson, wasn't it?
Just going to the environmental limits component, my concern is that central government sets human health and regional entities set the limits for environmental. They're not the same. They're not always the same, because when we talk about, say, nitrogen limits in water, It's very those two might intersect or not. If that's the case, then we need a really clear direction on what we need to do to get up to the plate.
Good. We'll move into the. It's a good point, and I see them noting those. So we'll move into the next parts of the presentation.
I think one other point, or two other points that I would note on this diagram as well. You mentioned regulatory relief. That's been something that's popped out in the media as a particular concern around the Resource Management Act, or a particular point that has been raised. And I also mentioned compliance as well. So what the Ministry of the Environment's fact sheets and information they've put out have suggested is that government's taking advice on establishing a national regulator with a regional presence, which suggests to me, and that would, were it to come in, would come in from the point of planning transition, so from 2029 onwards. Which suggests to me they haven't made a firm decision around that, and there will be opportunities for council to be able to provide positions in that space. I would also note Te Tiriti partnership in this as well. The bills as proposed have quite a change from the current Resource Management Act around Te Tiriti partnership. There's no general treaty clause, with decision makers being required to uphold treaty settlements and other arrangements, and more of a focus on iwi Māori being invited to comment and consultation as opposed to partnership.
Councillor Davis?
Just quickly on the limits thing, I think it's very blanket, and triggers are probably what we need more than limits. And I don't know where we put that in, but if you set a limit, everyone just drives fast to the limit, and then they get past the limit, and then we're years in a mess. Maybe somewhere about triggers or indicator species or something.
I would note that the bills include a structure around communities needing to agree a plan to bring measures back into environmental limits when they are breached. That we'll see what that looks like, and we'll have the opportunity to put in what that looks like. But thank you for that feedback. That's really useful. Jumping to the next point, which is the Emergency Management Bill, which was also introduced this week, and this is very very quick around this one because it looks more. It looks broadly similar to the legislation on which you submitted, or which council submitted in May this year. It's about modernising the CDM Act, lifting system performance, clarifying government roles. It broadly aligns with council's position, but it is another system change that sits within that context. Now, it won't surprise you to know that I'm not an expert in emergency management, but James Thompson is on the line if councillors have any questions about how this fits into the process. But I just do want to flag that as a rapid response team, we're trying to take on board all of these system changes and grapple with all of the complexity to support you to grapple with all of that complexity.
Any questions, John?
Not specifically. I've read through the bill and there's a lot to take in, but it does appear that it basically sits with the discussion documents, and regardless of what we might have thought, it's kind of landed where it is. I don't know if James has a comment as to whether it's progressive enough in his thinking for what the future looks like, as opposed to a rewrite of what was. Be interested in James's thoughts.
Yeah, James, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. I was just I'm up in Wellington at the NEMA office today, so yeah, I think it is going to take a bit of time to read through and actually work out some of the detail that's there. It's certainly got some ability to make some differences that we've been looking for. One example, Dion, that you talked about previously with your letter is how we get telecommunications entities to be more responsive to us during emergencies. And I think the new bill, if it goes through as it is, will allow the Director General to make rules, and one of those rules might be that that telecommunication providers have to provide the information that we request. So we will see over time those rules start to, that the Director General can make, supporting our work. I suppose the one thing that I would highlight is that as the Director General makes those rules, that there's still engagement with CDM groups or our emergency management committees and the emergency managers on making those rules. And it does say that, but that would be what I'd be looking out for. Thanks, John.
Thanks, James. And John?
And I guess one of the other significant changes is when a declaration is made, civil defence in a sense has been the lead, and fire and whoever have sat beside and worked with. The new legislation makes it very clear that if it's a fire service have the lead, and so I haven't quite got clear in my mind effectively James's role if fire is leading, all those other ancillary things, just what the relationship looks like from the difference between fighting the fire and then some of the other roles of civil defence. So just I don't know whether James has a thought. It's kind of what we do, but now it's mandated, so just how that plays out.
Yes, thanks, John. There is a piece there that still don't quite know the implications of what they mean by lead agency, particularly when there's a declared state of emergency. So yeah, the lead agency has certainly been clarified, which is great. Is or a regional or local controller.
Excellent. I've got a couple more questions. I've got Councillor Gerard and then Councillor Megan.
Thank you, Chair. It's with the reduction side of things, which I think about wildfire or flooding. That a lot of it's about a good land use planning, where our Spatial Planning Act will be an amazing tool that we can use for that. I'm just wondering how that relates then this bill and what it composes in this diagram here, how it fits in and what could possibly be a regional council's role in that area. Thank you.
So
that's a great question. Oh, do you want me to answer that?
Go for it, James.
Yeah, just under the old CDM Act, reduction was always there, but it was from a CDM group perspective, we could only influence it. We weren't able to make much difference. I think, and Patrick and others might be able to answer this more about how reduction fits into the new spatial plans and the other pieces that are coming on board. And I understand that there's going to be a greater role for MFE in reduction, particularly around climate adaptation, but I haven't got clarity on what that all looks like yet. Thank you.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say that's one of the many complexities that will need to be mapped into the spatial planning process within the very short time frame outlined to develop a spatial plan for the region, and knowing we still need to do to understand what specific things are involved in that spatial planning, to what extent is it across the entire region or to urban areas within the region. There's still more information that we need about what the expectations around the scale of spatial planning looks like.
Councillor Mackay?
Yes, kia ora. So this bill, contrary to what we're seeing elsewhere, this bill's really lifting the expectation around iwi partnership, particularly in recovery. And so there's an expectation to move from consultation to genuine shared decision making. And it's not an area I'm particularly familiar with, and we could already be doing that in a regional sense here. But I just wanted to note that I am totally available to help frame up bring together any of the leadership in Ngaitahu and Kapu in Runanga if that's needed. But really mindful that it's not a space I've been actively involved in.
Awesome, thank you. It will be. We have had good iwi or Ngaitahu engagement until recently, and then we've had some changes in Ngaitahu that have, I'd suggest, taken us a couple of steps back. But yeah, the new bill requires iwi Māori engagement. It's interesting it hasn't gone perhaps as far as we were hoping, and that we would actually end up with Māori representation on the committee. It puts Māori representation on the coordinating executive group, which is at that chief executive level. So I'm not quite sure yet how that comes together. The other one that's interesting is we've got to now consult with community where they feel that they're disadvantaged or challenged in other ways. And once again, we don't quite know yet how we would do that and how we would integrate that into our emergency management plan that we'll have to write.
Thanks,
Thank
James.
you. Really interesting.
Thanks, Megan, for the question, and thanks, James, for your time. I've just made a mistake. I thought this was going to 4, and I've just realised it was to 3:45. So that's on me. My apologies to everybody who might have a meeting now. But can we continue into the next section, because we're just into the how councillors can get involved in the opportunities in that space, and then we'll get through that, and then we'll ask questions at the end, if that's okay.
Yes, I was worried we were going to miss this last section as well, so thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to Cecilia for this section.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so I'll just touch on the opportunities over the next couple of months and that sort of 2 to 3 month timeline that Patrick introduced at the beginning of the briefing. So, yeah, submissions are one way to influence proposals and also be transparent with the community about the outcomes you seek. So staff, we propose that council provides submissions on all these proposals, and we've been working together to work out what that approach to the submissions might be, given the complexity and number of submissions and timeframes that we're working within. So to be impactful, we've come up with some key objectives of the submission. And we propose that this submissions are constructive and focus on what will lead to the best possible outcomes for communities, whilst recognising outcomes sought by the government, that they're grounded in the Canterbury context, experience and expertise, and so really focusing on what's important to Canterbury and to regional government. That all the submissions will be connected and speak to one another, so that council's positions are very clear and consistent, and that also that they'll align and build on council's previous advocacy submissions and the proactive strategic work to date. And we had a briefing on that last week with the package of proactive strategic work. They will be high level, noting the timeframes, and that there will be a number of details and iterations as the legislation moves through the select committee processes, and also noting the range of other expertise out there, law firms sort of looking at the line-by-line clauses, and so there will be others focusing on areas as well. After the briefing today, we will be providing some more information and analysis for councillors to inform submission direction ahead of Christmas. And once we understand those exact consultation timeframes, we'll confirm the proposed approach in terms of working with councillors to seek direction and then approval of the submissions. So we've looked earlier today, and Patrick's spoken to the complexity across all the proposals and bigger picture of what this might mean. And so together as staff, we've been identifying key themes across key themes that each of the submissions could include. And our intent is to use these themes to provide a structured approach across all the submissions so that council's position is clear, consistent, reinforced and targeted. And this will also help us sort of pivot and develop the submissions in the short timeframes we're working within. So the themes are up there on the slide there, but we've identified transition and implementation, functions and responsibilities at a regional scale, funding and financial sustainability, governance and decision-making, and Te Tiriti partnership. and that these will be underpinned with the focus on community outcomes and the environment, and build on previous work, including the position statements. And submissions would then be further tailored for specific content related to the proposals. So submissions are one way and the formal way to respond to proposals, but not the only option. And as regional leaders, you do have other ways that you can influence outcomes, and this slide just gives some examples of those, including use of the media, engaging with partners, other councils, industry and stakeholders, and discussions with political contacts. And just like to note that we're happy to support councillors with any advice to support that process and proactive engagement opportunities. Move on. So this slide you saw at the beginning of the presentation, that really focuses on the next 2 months in response during the consultation periods. And as Patrick notes, we don't know the exact timeframes for the Emergency Management Bill and 2 resource management bills yet. The Emergency Management Bill was referred to the Select Committee yesterday after the first reading, so hopefully in the next couple of days we should be able to understand what that timeframe is. And the RM bills are set down for a first reading next week, so again they'll be referred to the Select Committee after that. And following that, we should be able to hopefully understand those timeframes reasonably quickly and before Christmas. And so we'll provide advice on the approach. But this slide just presents some options and an outline of what the submission development process will likely look like, and then some options in terms of Council coming back together to approve those submissions, and then also reporting them back at a later date for transparency.
All right. We've also just want to note that on the 17th of December, we've also got a 2-hour workshop with Council on RM and the simplification, so that we can get more direction to inform the direction of the council and what we want to do. So is there any other questions from councillors at the moment? I think I've got, I'll go with Councillor Mackay and then Councillor Campbell and then Gerard.
Is that Megan Mackay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, kia ora. Look, this is really helpful. I think they're really good themes to submit on, and I feel with this RMA the fog is starting to lift and we're starting to actually see what the future will look like with new planning tribunals and increased roles for independent hearing panels, and some of the resource consent stuff moving into more permitted but with notice. But my question, the part that I'm left really stuck is understanding the environmental limits piece and how, when that happens, and does it happen before or after spatial planning? Surely it would be before spatial planning. And so it's more for to ask in the next session that the chair just spoke to. It would be really helpful. Was that, if that wasn't in the presentation, it would be helpful to understand a little bit more about the timeframes, but also more about what those environmental limits look like. And it might be that that part is still in the fog.
Yeah, that's the secondary legislation. Patrick?
Yeah, but we can map out as much as we can about what we know about environmental limits and the advice around those and their interactions with the other components of the legislation in the pieces that we'll be providing you tomorrow for your consideration in advance of that that session next week. So you'll get written one-pagers about a number of these particular focus areas.
And just on those instruments, in that 17th workshop, it would be quite useful if we can have a small conversation about how we maybe as a council, especially in our local regional context, how we can how we can influence that space. So what is the political influence or advocacy that we can do to make sure that there is a local and regional sort of lens on some of those national instruments that are coming through.
Can you look back at previous submissions to this government and figure out where something's actually been taken on board and what's worked, and kind of let us know so that we're aware perhaps of language and nuance that will or won't work?
Yes, I mean, part of the process we definitely look at and analyse all the previous submissions that we provided on past proposals, and as these pieces of legislation has been developed as well. So yes, certainly that is part of the, and we'll be providing that as part of the advice. This is what's previously been said and what's landed. Yeah.
Councillor Gerard.
Yeah, this question about intellectual and institutional knowledge that this organisation has built up over the years, and with like I've worked for central, regional, and local government and corporates, GHD and Opus, and also with Ministry of Work, Forestry, one of them, was, we had the big skip and we were just throwing all the books and everything into this big skip. It was what happens in this transition of local government to what we've built up.
I might hand over to Stephanie to be able to ask. Sorry, but because I wasn't here at the time, to reflect some of the transition planning that the Canberra Regional Council did with the last RMA, to just reflect some of the last NBEA, to reflect some of the processes that we put in place around those to wrap up a transition of this scale.
Thanks, Patrick, and through councillors, we certainly had mapped out the timelines and the next steps. So this is with regard to the Spatial Planning Act and the Natural Built Environment Act. Of course, there was a much longer time frame of 10 years as opposed to the shortened one. In terms of the retention of the knowledge in the organization, the way I think that needs to work is that you have pathways of change and you work through what the impacts of those are and when they will be. We now have the timeline, we know what's in the content, and then we need to think about what is the knowledge and what is the labor, if you like, that needs to go to that. From my perspective, we should not be losing talent in order to replace it only 3 years from now at a much higher cost to ratepayers or taxpayers. So we need to map out the knowledge that we need and the talent and then how we use that. And that's effectively a labor or a workforce plan, and you need a transition plan for that from the organization. That is a bit harder to do when you don't know what you're transitioning to. There are moots in the proposals, and what we need to do is just do pathways towards that and then be tactical about which way we go. And that's something I want to share with council as we proceed, because there are impacts for staff in this organization, but importantly, there are impacts for the delivery of this work for the Canterbury region overall, which is your point, councillor. So thank you very much for highlighting that.
Councillor Mackay. Claire Mackay.
I guess my comment is just aligning around that and just wondering whether when a little memo comes back around possibly what limits look like or how that might play out, is that we in Canterbury here should not forget the work that's been done through our zone committees and our ZIP addendums and our respective plan changes that have occurred and then the last, well, certainly some plan changes even more recently, but prior to that as well. So I mean, there are a whole lot of there are some building blocks that we should be actually making sure that we make use of as a good platform, and if they last there for 3 or 5 or 10 years, I think that's a really good place to start anyway. So new councillors that haven't been involved in those planning processes, or zone committees that have gone through planning processes, or as an outside person been involved in it, I think it would be helpful to have a couple of paragraphs around that.
You've got Councillor Moody, you've got 10 seconds.
Just to echo what you said, Chair, and Councillor Campbell, love to have that guidance around overlap between government's ambitions and ours, and where the wiggle room is for our discussions with political contacts.
Did you have something, Councillor Davies? I'll give you 5 seconds.
I'm just wondering if there's been any inclination of anything about the LTMA, the Land Transport Management Act, like how transport's shaping up in this, or is this going to come stage 2 when we get into the reorganisation?
I couldn't speak to that, but into this context, if that's something that we need to do to make sure that we're engaging with the whole breadth of the regional council's work. So thank you, Councillor.
That's good. Thank you. And looking at that timeline, there's also one other piece of homework that councillors will have during this time. That break will be the annual plan. So there's definitely a lot of stuff coming for us to do over that period, and for the staff as well. But thank you so much for the presentation, for giving us the information. Everybody who's inputted into the rapid response and transition into the rapid transition stuff that you're doing. It's just the beginning. There's a lot to do, and I just hope that we can lead a good response for the region. Councillor Sunkel?
Can I just ask who might be leading the work on the EM bill in our thinking that I might be able to have a conversation with?
James.
Okay.
James is your best contact.
So who's on closing karakia today? Oh, did we? Okay, so we're all good. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next time.